the disruptor is, I'll talk about it again just in this format because I've talked about it a couple times, and it's the best way in my opinion to describe the disruptor. So the way the disruptor used to be is it just detonates after 2 seconds, and it can do a huge amount of damage. And it's so you have 2 disruptors here. You have the new disruptor on this hand, and then you have the old disruptor, the one they're going back to on this hand. And this old disruptor is a much higher risk reward, where you can get way more damage with this old disruptor. You can get massive game-changing shots. You get shots that people are like, oh great, you know, I thought they were done with game-ending damage, and they're going to post on Reddit and they're going to say, oh, I hate game-ending damage. You're going to have these type of shots with this. Well, then you're going to have a bunch of other games where they don't get much damage because it's such a big risk. Because now, this disruptor, in theory, is actually way better than the disruptor we currently have. The reason being, this disruptor has way more counterplay. Kind of like how the force field was something Zerg's players hated for a long time because there was no counterplay to the force field for a long time, right? It's like Zergs really couldn't do anything against force fields. You force field, now they have Ravengers and stuff like that, but for a long time there was no counterplay to the force field. This disruptor now doesn't have a lot of counterplay, believe it or not. You don't see it versus Zerg because Lings just annihilate it, but PvT and PvP, you can't really challenge disruptors when they get into high up numbers. So disruptors are really strong right now because, will I call this a nerf going back to the old disruptors? Depends who's using it. Maybe, because the current disruptor, if you have let's say you have 4 disruptors just sitting idle, you're not paying attention to them, and a Terran comes in on you and they stim and they want to kill your disruptors because you're not paying attention, you're looking at something else. You know, they're dropping in your main, they're like, okay, I'm gonna kill these 4 disruptors real quick, and then you see it last second, you just fly 2 shots off and they insta detonate and they punish the Terran opponent for trying to kill them. Now, with the old disruptor, what happens is you have these 4 disruptors here. Terran catches you sleeping. He stims in. He kills all 4. And, you know, even if you shoot up the shots, they won't detonate in time. You lose all 4 disruptors. So you can get punished much harder with. There's way more counterplay to the disruptor they're going back to because you're just able to challenge it. Another scenario, PvP. In the current variation we have right now, you have nothing challenges the disruptor in PvP. Stalkers don't challenge it. Zealots don't. Charge lots don't challenge it. Adepts. Any ground unit does not beat the disruptor in PvP. I mean, obviously, once you get to high, you have to get to high numbers. But once you get to, you know, a good disruptor count, which is probably 6 or 7 plus, nothing beats the disruptor. Nothing. In the current meta right now, and you don't see it a whole lot because Stargate is king right now. People are opening Phoenix. People are opening Sky, and it's just they're just challenging you with Sky Toss, or they're challenging you with Phoenix and Oracles. But lately I've been going Blink Opener and going into Disruptors a lot, and it has had a lot of success. But right now, the way it currently is, let's say you have 10 Disruptors, which is very reasonable because you're going to be double pumping Disruptors in PvP in today's game. So you have 10 Disruptors, and that might be, you know, that's a decent amount. And they have a bunch of Zealots, and they have you in a 360 surround. They've got the perfect engagement. They swarm in onto you. You don't get punished for that. You blink your Stalkers out, and then you just spam every single Disruptor shot you have. All the Zealots die. All the Zealots die. And the cooldown is so quick with these current Disruptors that they can't punish you with any other unit. I mean, they lost so much of their army in these Zealots, and they just can't punish you. You're able to fall back and still get Disruptor shots, and you cannot get punished. The only counter to Disruptors in today's meta is Phoenix. You have to be going on double Stargate Phoenix to lift up these Disruptors. But even still, the Disruptors in today's game, you can still, you know, it still can be really hard to beat because you just focus on the Phoenix and then you go heavy Disruptors. Now, it's not a huge part of the meta right now, so I won't say it's super broken or anything right now. But there's way less counterplay in the current Disruptor because it's really only Phoenix and taking good engagement after being in a good spot. Compare that to the old Disruptor PvP. Way more counterplay. It's going to be a lot harder to pull pulling Disruptors off with the old Disruptor is way harder because a lot of things counter. Blink Stalkers can counter Disruptors. Charge Lots can counter Disruptors. Obviously, Phoenix still counter Disruptors, but they're even better now because Phoenix and Charge Lots are much stronger now in the old days. Because the reason being, the 2-second delay. If you get a bunch of Charge Lots in, you can shoot the Disruptors on top of your own Zealots. But a lot of times it can be very hard to land those shots. You have so many Disruptors. Let's say you have 10 Disruptors again, and they land a huge 360 surround. You will lose every single Disruptor. and you can just get so much more damage. Charge Out Archon is just way stronger because you can snipe disruptors before they detonate, and then you just win the fight. Charge Out Archon Immortal with Phoenix is way scarier with the old disruptor than it is with the current disruptor. It's way scarier. With this disruptor, you have to be way more clean with your play. You have to be very careful not to let these zealots get on top of you. You probably need more army. And then also the old disruptors, for people who remember, you had these huge Blink Stalker disruptor wars where Blink Stalkers can actually be very real counter to disruptors, where you're able to actually blink forward onto the disruptor and snipe it. In today's meta, you have three disruptors, 12 stalkers blink on top of them to try to snipe them before they shoot off. You can't blink onto them because in the shot they'll just shoot 3 shots and you'll just lose all your stalkers. But in the disruptor they're going back to, if you have 3 disruptors versus 12 stalkers and you blink and try to snipe 3, you could kill all 3. You could kill all 3. And there's just way more micro because in the disruptor they're going back to, if you blink on, and then even if he's got like 4 disruptors, you can snipe 2, and then you box and you split your stalkers around to where the shot's going. You can just kind of micro away. It's not that instant death. So there's way more counterplay. So the difference between the 2 disruptors are the one we currently have is much safer, much easier to use for a lot of players. I think the old disruptor will make the disruptor a very not highly used unit again. I mean, that's why it was interesting they changed the disruptor in the first place, because when they had this disruptor they're going back to, the disruptor was not used very much. It really was not used very much. And now the disruptor is quite meta. A lot of people build it. It's not seen that much in PvP, but it's very meta in PvT. And there's just less counterplay to the current disruptor, right? You imagine your Terran players out there, your Protoss players out there. It's hard to stim bio. It's hard to challenge it. In the current disruptor, even Terran, the new disruptor, Terran will even have 3 options to beat them now, right? You can snipe them. You can start to snipe them. You can split your armies with stim, right? You can run backwards and you won't instantly die. And you can lift up into your medvac. So there's 3 pretty good counter paths to just going Pio against disruptors, where today, you get that instant shot off and you can crumble an army pretty quickly. So all in all, thinking about the 2 disruptors side by side, I mean, one difference is you can't use this disruptor in today's game versus Zerg, and this disruptor you will be able to use versus Zerg, so that'll be nice. That'll be interesting. I'm sure I'll be working that, because actually one of my strongest times is when I used to go Archon Disruptor. That'd be a really strong composition I was going for, back when DT drop was the meta. So we'll see what I do now, but my end thoughts on the disruptor is, do I think the disruptor is weaker than... Do I think the old disruptor is better than the new disruptor? I know it's exciting and I know it's hype, and I am excited because the old disruptor gives you so many more exciting and fun moments. It really does. It takes your breath, where it's like, you're watching a game and it's like, oh my god. Like the old disruptor really gets huge hits that are exciting, and there's huge counter damage where they stim and they kill 3 disruptors, and there's so much of that intense on both ends. A lot of people will see a huge disruptor hit and they'll say, oh, my game ending damage, Blizzard, save me. But there's so much more that goes on, and it's such a harder unit to use. Yes, you can get much bigger hits, which I'm obviously excited about, because those massive hits are something you dream of. But there's so much more counterplay to this disruptor that it actually makes them weaker than this disruptor, in my opinion. Well, we'll see. Weaker for the vast majority. I think for players that are good with disruptors, this one will still be good and maybe a little bit better. But it's situational, and I think it's just a bigger risk going for the old disruptors than the current disruptors. I think the disruptors now are a lot safer, and I think the old disruptors, can be more game changing than the current disruptors. But again, you have to have good mechanics. You have to have good macro, good clean micro, because the old disruptors can get challenged way more than they can get challenged right now. So it's interesting. It is interesting to compare them to. And that's why I think the Colossus will be used again, right? Because I think this old disruptor, for 95% of the community, is very hard to use. I always felt like the disruptor is one of the hardest units to use in the entire game. The new disruptor has made it is a lot easier to use because it's more spammable. You know, you don't have to micro it as much. You just shoot into their army and it will detonate for you. But the old one, you have to, especially I can remember those, you know, PvP, PvT, you would shoot it off, and then not only would he split, but you would split with the Terran. So like the Terran has his army here, and he would split into 2 pieces, and you would shoot your disruptor shot, and then you would, I'd grab the disruptor bolt and I'd move it to the Terran shot because you got to split with them. So it's this big micro game with this disruptor, and you can get awesome shots. So I'm really excited for the old disruptor because you can get those fun shots that make StarCraft fun. I mean, this disruptor now is obviously still fun to get good shots with, but the old disruptor was truly fun to get. And like those PvPs, you know, you're on the edge of your feet. You're like, where are his disruptors? You're going like Blink Stalker disruptor, Blink Stalker disruptor. In the old disruptor days, was some of the best StarCraft to watch, in my opinion, in all of StarCraft. Obviously, some people hate it, but it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. But I do think, yeah, I think this old disruptor is, there's way more. You can have a high ceiling with it. You can get some good damage, but for a lot of players, this old disruptor is very hard to use because you have to be very more precise with your control, and you get way more punished. This disruptor gets way more punished than the disruptor of today. So that's the biggest takeaway between the old disruptor and the new disruptor, in my opinion, is the current disruptor is much harder to punish. You can be a little bit careless with the disruptor of today, and the disruptor of the old days you had to be very careful with. That's why it was always surprising to me they ever changed in the first place, because I mean, I already said this a little bit, but yeah, it was always surprising to me they changed it because, one, the disruptor was not even used that much when they ended up making this original change, and 2, the current disruptor has way less counterplay than the original disruptor, which is interesting because, you know, usually you want counterplay and stuff like that. But in the end, is it fair for a 1 second of slip to lose you the game? See, you know, you'll always have people like that, like you out there, BYB Basics, and you only see it from one end. You really only see it from one end. And, like, is it really 1 second, though? I mean, it takes 2 seconds, so you're incorrect. 2 seconds and the game could end. But on a more serious note, there's so much more that goes into the disruptor shot. Like, you're only seeing it from the player that is receiving the disruptor. You're not considering it from the risk of the player going for this disruptor. There's so much risk in going for disruptors. I'll tell you why. I mean, like in the couple games you get big wins, there are so many games where you will lose with the disruptor. It's like hard to, like, people always look at the disruptor, and I'm only talking about the old disruptor now. In my opinion, obviously people will not agree with this, especially because now the disruptor is way more common now. But in my opinion, the old disruptor could be the hardest unit to use in the entire game, and especially for Masters and below players, I think the old disruptor is extremely hard, and almost downright scary. And most players, from I would guess from Masters and below, and maybe Grandmasters and below, the least used Protoss unit is the disruptor, or the least made Protoss unit is the disruptor. Maybe the Observer. Well, probably not the Observer because Observer's made a lot, but I would argue, I would guess the Tempest is the least made unit in the entire ladder, in my opinion. And it is so hard to use that there's so much control, and it's a mid game unit. It's a mid game unit. You're trying to make mid game happen because what is the disruptor good versus late game? You know, it's not good versus Broods. It's not good versus Vipers. It's not good versus Carriers. It's not good versus Tempest. It's not really. I mean, you can somewhat make it work against Mass Liberators, but you need to have Tempest, of course, and good stalker control. So it's a mid-game unit. You're making a big commitment to the mid-game to try to take some good fights and get yourself a lead, because otherwise you're going to lose late-game always. That's why Disruptor is always a risk to go versus Zerg, because if they just go up to Hive, you just die on Hive, because you don't have your Storm, you can't handle Carriers, you can't. Disruptor Carrier is not very good. Carrier Storm is what's good. So you run into way more issues with going Disruptor, just a way bigger risk. And like, yeah, you can get the game any damage you want, but there's I really don't like that argument as much, because there's just so much control from the Protoss's end, where yes, you can get the big shot, but there's so much counterplay to the old Disruptor. If you're sleeping and a bunch of Banelings kill your army, or a bunch of Zerglings surround your army and you lose, are you not as upset? Like that can happen in 2 seconds as well, my friend. You know, that type of stuff. A big Widow might drop in your main, kills all your workers. That can happen in 2 seconds. the disruptor they're going back to, yes, it can get a big shot, but there's so much more counterplay than the current. I mean, I just went over it, but there's just, you can snipe it, you can dodge it. You just, like those two, like if you're Terran, and you're like, oh, the new disruptor can kill my entire army. Yeah, maybe, but also you can lift up, you can snipe it before it detonates, you can stem away from it and split your army. It's not like you're just gonna. You act like every shot that goes off with the old disruptor is a huge game-ending one, and there's just so much that goes into the old disruptor. So, if it's 90% of players, is it? If it's not using it, I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, you never want to take a unit out of the game. The Zergling, well, it won't affect Zerg as much because you won't hit the Zerglings anymore. So, same thing over again. I mean, I just repeated myself at the end there because of that question.